Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us. This is Left Bank Books welcomes founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, Laura Bates, who will discuss her new book, Men Who Hate Women, From Incels to Pickup Artists: The Truth About Extreme Misogyny and How It Affects Us All. Bates will be in conversation with author and executive director of the Representation Project, Soraya Chemaly. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Laura and Soraya, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world even. We are happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you or for your friends at left-bank.com. I will provide a link directly to both of the books that will be talked about today in the comments. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. It allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, at the end of the event, so please type your questions as a comment. You can do that at any point in time throughout the event as it comes to your mind. So just type those up in the comment section. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We have so many incredible events lined up for the year and are adding events daily. About today's book, Men Who Hate Women, a groundbreaking book that pulls back the curtain on the terrorist movement no one is talking about. Women's rights activist Laura Bates has been the target of many misogynistic attacks online, from hate-fueled Twitter rants to vivid descriptions of her own rape and even death threats. At first, the vitriol seemed to be the work of a small handful of individual men, but over time, the volume and consistency of the attacks hinted at something bigger and more ominous. As Bates followed the thread of online misogyny further into the corners of the internet, the spiral of hateful and toxic rhetoric deepened until she found an unseen, organized movement of thousands of anonymous men wishing violence and worse upon women. The terrorism no one is talking about. Men Who Hate Women examines the rise of secretive extremist communities who despise women as Bates traces the roots of misogyny across a complex spiderweb of groups extending from men's rights activists to trolls and the incel movement. Drawing parallels to other extremist movements around the world, including white nationalism, Bates shows what attracts men to the movement, how it grooms and radicalizes boys, how it operates, and what can be done to stop it. Most urgently of all, she follows the pathways this extreme ideology has taken from the darkest corners of the internet to emerge covertly into our mainstream media, our playgrounds, and our government. Going undercover on and offline, Bates provides the first comprehensive look at this under-the-radar phenomenon, including eye-opening interviews with former members of these communities, the academics studying this movement, and the men fighting back. By turns, fascinating and horrifying, Men Who Hate Women is a broad, unflinching account of the deep current of loathing towards women and anti-feminism that underpins our society and is a must-read for parents, educators, and anyone who believes in equality for women. The Sunday Times says, Men Who Hate Women has the power to spark social change. About today's speakers. Laura Bates is the founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, a crowdsourced collection of stories from women around the world about their experiences with gender inequality. Laura has received the 2015 British Empire Medal in the Queen's Birthday Honours, the WMC Digital Media Award from the Women's Media Centre, the Georgina Henry Prize, has been named in the BBC Women's Hour Powerlist 2014 Game Changers, and won Cosmopolitan's Ultimate Woman of the Year award. She was also named in CNN's 10 Visionary Women list. Follow her efforts on Twitter at Everyday Sexism. And today, Laura will be in conversation with Soraya Chemaly. Soraya is currently the executive director of the Representation Project. An award-winning author and activist, she writes and speaks frequently on topics related to gender norms, inclusivity, social justice, free speech, sexualized violence, and technology. The former director and co-founder of the Women's Media Center Speech Project, she has long been committed to expanding women's civic and political participation. Soraya is also the author of Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger, which was recognized as a best book of 2018 by The Washington Post, Fast Company, Psychology Today, Autostraddle, and NPR, and has been translated into several languages. And now I'm incredibly happy and proud to introduce our guests for the afternoon, Laura Bates and Soraya Chemaly for Left Bank Books. If you would please join me in giving them a round of applause. Hello, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Jane.
A fantastic audience here already from people all over the world. We already have hello from Portugal, regards from Saudi Arabia. So we have an audience here that is very excited to hear you speak, and I'm going to turn over the conversation to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shane.
Well, Laura, good afternoon in London.
Hi.
It's just so terrific to have this chance to talk to you. For those who have joined us, Laura and I are old friends and collaborators, and really delighted to be having this conversation, as difficult and dark as this topic can get. So we encourage you, please, to submit your questions. Both Laura and I have sort of been immersed in these ideas and work for a long time, and I should probably give a warning in advance that we both have a tendency to be clear with our language. We're not really going to be using tidy euphemisms, and we'll discuss why, if that's the case. But I just wanted to give everybody a heads up, because actually the topic that Laura has written so brilliantly and importantly about is frankly ugly. And until we can really grapple with that as a global culture, it'll be hard to stem. So I'm going to jump right in, stop talking, and ask you, Laura, to explain how you came to write this book. And maybe actually, for those of you who maybe are familiar with everyday sexism, but not with Laura's other work, she's written so many other really remarkable books. So maybe talk about how they relate to this one.
Sure. Well, the Everyday Sexism Project, which some people watching might not know, is an ever-increasing collection of hundreds of thousands of testimonies of daily experiences of any form of gender inequality. We collect experiences from people of all genders, and they range from street harassment to workplace discrimination to sexual violence and assault. And the project is almost 10 years old, and it's now the largest data set of its kind of these testimonies all together in one place. We have hundreds of thousands of testimonies, and in the course of collecting them, originally for the purposes of awareness raising, and then later for the purposes of kind of concrete change, using elements of the stories that we'd collected in a very targeted way to tackle things from sexual violence on the transport network to sexual violence in schools, for example, there was a backlash. And I think this is something that probably many people listening will recognize. It's something that many women online have experienced. It's something that I think women of color online, trans women, disabled women experience to a more intense and intersectional degree online. It's something that any woman who has a political opinion or who speaks about feminism online will certainly relate to. And that is a backlash of pretty extreme and intense abuse. And when you become the target of that abuse, I think to an extent you begin to become familiar with the communities it's originating from. And that was certainly the case for me over time. So from the beginning of founding the Everyday Sexism Project, perhaps 200 times a day, men would contact me detailing what 7 weapons they'd like to use to disembowel me with and what order they'd use them in. So I became aware of this kind of murky world, these online communities who often in highly organized ways were targeting and trying to silence women. But there was an argument for a long time that we shouldn't give these communities the oxygen of publicity, that we shouldn't be talking about them and giving them the attention they craved, which I was very sympathetic to for a long time. But two things shifted for me. The first was that the number of men actually coming offline and acting in the name of these ideologies, specifically carrying out terrorist massacres of women, was increasing, and that the number of those massacres or attempted massacres has increased exponentially in the last few years alone. But when those massacres happen, we don't connect them to this ideology. We don't describe them as terrorism in the media. We don't charge these men as terrorists. They don't go through the criminal justice system in that way. And then the other thing that for me was really the trigger behind wanting to write this book was suddenly recognizing the efficiency with which these communities are grooming and radicalizing boys. So because of my work with everyday sexism, I spend a lot of time in schools working with young people, with thousands of young people across the country. And I started to notice that boys were very different in the sessions I was running in the last perhaps 2 years compared to the previous 8.
Right.
They were coming extremely angry. They were coming already very desensitized to any kind of conversation. They were coming radicalized. They were coming fully believing that there is a vast government conspiracy against white men who are the real victims of today's society, believing that there is a vast conspiracy of false rape allegations bringing down men's careers, spouting the same false statistics about, for example, men being the majority of victims of domestic abuse, and the same taglines and quotes from these online groups that for so long we've been trying not to talk about. And I suddenly realized that these groups were so effectively reaching and grooming young men that actually at this point, not talking about them openly and having the vast majority of people not know that these communities exist was actually a negative, because it prevents us from trying to tackle the problem. And that was what made me want to write the book.
So let's jump into that a little bit for people who don't live in this world, right? I mean, I think you've described what it's like to be at the end of the fire hose. I think that sometimes the way that this was depicted, as you said, was something to be left in the dark corners of the internet. And it's part of the reason I don't really like the word trolls, because it suggests a sort of monstrous exception, as opposed to the fact that so many of these spaces are populated by men we know, are populated by young boys who are neighbors or sons. And so can you talk about, can you break out those communities? Because there are so many, and in my mind, they overlap like a Venn diagram. They are different, and they run the gamut between incels, which we know have been associated quite explicitly now with terroristic violence in the UK, Norway, the US, Canada, to pick up artists, and men going their own way. Can you break that taxonomy down for people a little bit and talk about what these cultures look like, how they appeal to young boys and men?
Yes, so we're certainly talking about overlapping networks here. They have a great deal in common. What they have in common is a complete and utter dehumanization of women and the reduction of women to objects to service men. But they see that in various quite different ways, depending on which group you're talking about. So they have a kind of foundational baseline, if you like, from which they all spring. Many of them describe the same language, for example, of taking the red pill, which is an analogy borrowed from the Matrix, for the moment at which they enter the world of one of these communities and realize that they've been lied to their whole lives, and that men are the real victims of society, and that women hold all the power, and that women are evil. So there's that kind of commonality between them. But you then have these different groups. So you have incels who believe that the sole purpose of women is to give men sex, and that women are all powerful in our society, and that if you are a man who isn't having sex, who is involuntarily celibate, in other words, that you are being actively and hatefully deprived by women whose duty it is to have sex with you. And incels believe in what they describe as a day of retribution, or an incel rebellion, when they will rise up and massacre women to punish them as a result. They spend a lot of time talking about things like the redistribution of sex, the idea that women should be forcibly traded to men as commodities by the government. So they are very extreme in their beliefs. They're very focused on sex, and they absolutely, repeatedly and en masse advocate for women to be massacred and slaughtered. I can't stress that enough, because I think it's easy to think that you must be talking about a handful of outliers that would have that kind of ideology. But we're really talking about an entire community, and numbering in the tens or hundreds of thousands with that specific idea.
I I don't know if you have any examples of this. I'm trying to think of some myself, but I think it's important too to talk about the way those ideas get laundered up through the media ecosystem, so that people that appear to be otherwise quote unquote normal and rational maybe have a more conservative framing. They are in fact taking components of all this ideology and stringing it together to make it palatable.
Absolutely. And it's sanitized. So there are interlocutors who will offer kind of a very slightly sanitized, a slightly more acceptable version of this ideology. And incels and these other extremist groups are obsessed with what they describe as the Overton window, which is the kind of the bracket of accepted, normalized discourse in our society. And their argument is that if enough mainstream figures pay lip service to their ideas, throw kind of dog whistles to these communities, then they kind of grease the wheels of the radicalization machine. So a good example of this, I would say, is Donald Trump. Soon after Brett Kavanaugh's trial, or the media frenzy around him, coming out and saying it's a very scary time to be a young man in America. So at face value, you wouldn't necessarily directly link that statement to these groups. But we know from a Cambridge Analytical whistleblower, Christopher Wiley, that Steve Bannon had very deliberately courted votes of incels for Donald Trump. So there are very clear examples of where it works both ways. So incels went wild when Donald Trump said that. They saw it as a tacit encouragement of their ideology. And what they believe is that it becomes much easier to radicalize a teenage boy into believing that the whole world is stacked against him and there's this crazy conspiracy if the president of the United States is kind of saying the same thing. And you can see it in other examples where the media provides a platform to these men. So, for example, there was a group in the UK called the Anti-Feminism League. This was a men's rights activist group, another one of the types of communities that I look at in the book. These are men who claim to care about very real pressing issues that affect men, but actually they double down on exactly the issues that create those problems in the first place. They don't spend any of their time actually trying to tackle the men's mental health crisis or trying to support male survivors of sexual violence, for example. They spend their time bringing lawsuits against frontline women's sexual violence services and attacking feminists. This particular group, for example, had a website full of articles saying things like 19 reasons why women lie about rape and so on. But they rebranded themselves as a political party. They officially signed up to be a political party, even though nothing changed in terms of their membership or their ideology. And they were given blank across the media. So they were given a huge amount of coverage. Their manifesto, which included things like taking away the Equality Act, was suddenly in all of our national newspapers, because for the media, there's a real interest in creating what's seen as a kind of clickbait controversy and platforming these guys in spite of what they're saying, in spite of the fact that in our general election, all of the candidates that this party stood between them garnered 216 votes. And there's no other political outfit that's getting that number of votes who's on every single newspaper, every single media outlet. But there are many ways like that in which actually these ideologies that we might think of as quite fringe and quite offline, they're actually finding their way through the media, through kind of mainstream figures. And it's beneficial for those mainstream figures because they get this swell of online support. They get the kind of clickbait controversy angle that gets people outraged and therefore clicking on it more. But there are also many serving politicians who have either been heavily influenced by or have been members of these groups themselves. So, for example, Betsy DeVos met with a group that was quite famously very involved in these communities and then changed the provisions for campus sexual violence in the United States to disadvantage survivors, essentially. There are examples of serving representatives, political representatives who have been both public mainstream politicians and also running some of this content, running these extremist women-hating groups online. One example was a man who, in his public-facing role, was a politician, an elected representative, and online was running a website where he personally wrote, for example, that rape isn't all bad because at least the rapist enjoys it. So this is much more mainstream, and the connections to the mainstream, to politics, to the media, they are much more tangible than we'd like to think when we use that euphemism trolls and we think of a handful of men under a bridge, sitting in their parents' basement, never seeing the light of day, with no kind of real life influence.
So let's talk about the baseline levels of tolerance for all kinds of violence against women. And, you know, I think there are some similarities between the UK and the US, but anti-Black, anti-Muslim, white supremacist, anti-Asian, the example we just had, the terrible example in Atlanta. Can you talk about this relationship? I think what I'm specifically going to ask you is if you can talk about the way these ideologies mutually construct each other. But I think that for a lot of people, when someone like you or like me says there's misogyny, and then, oh, by the way, Black women and brown women and Asian women, it's additive. But that's really not the way this works, right? It's really not the fact that you can take a problem that women have as a class of people and then just add flavors of that. And so can you talk about the ways in which intersectionality matters and in the way it functions in terms of being more multiplicative? Like, really, you can't separate these things in your life or the way the culture sees you. And so you end up having a much more precarious relationship, not just to the possibility of violence, but to law enforcement, for example, because so much of the violence also is perpetrated against women, unfortunately, by law enforcement representatives.
Absolutely. So this is something that I think we like to traditionally think of in society as completely separate issues, completely separate problems. Like, here's Islamophobia, here's anti-Semitism, here's racism, homophobia, sexism, and they're completely different and they have completely different solutions. And even though recently there have been strides towards trying to recognize those intersections, when we use that term, I think a lot of people think what we're talking about is that, oh, well, okay, some people experience both. So they think that what you mean by that is that on one particular day, a Black woman experiences racism, and on another day she walks out of her house and she gets a sexist comment, and because she gets both, that means that it's worse for her. But what we're talking about, if you look at the lived experiences that are reported to the Everyday Sexism Project, if you look at the hate movements that are driving this, is something that is much, much more deeply intertwined and therefore much more cumulative than that at every possible level, at every layer. So in terms of women's daily experiences, it's both all at once. It's not one and then the other. It's a woman being told to do a pole dance around her walking stick. It's an Asian woman on campus with her university boyfriend when people start shouting at him, asking if she's a mail order bride. And when you look at the roots of these movements and where they're coming from, you recognize it's not just that they're kind of they're close to each other, that they're associated, that there is some connections. It's much more that they're part of the same beast, and we're looking at different branches of them. So what I mean by that is that within the incel community, for example, there is absolutely rampant racism. This is largely a white middle-class phenomenon. It's college-educated men between the ages of 18 and 34 that we're looking at really specifically. And these are not men who are only furious that women aren't having sex with them. These are men who are furious that women are having sex with men who aren't white, in particular, explicitly.
And reproducing for more of the eugenics.
Which, of course, then brings you to white supremacy and to white nationalism. So white nationalists are obsessed with birth rates and what with the so-called replacement theory. In other words, they are obsessed with this idea of a kind of invading horde of what they perceive to be savage men of color, plundering essentially the kind of dehumanized, fragile commodity of white women. They are obsessed with forcible sterilization of Black women in particular, for example. They're obsessed with the idea of forcing white women into sexual slavery to create a master race. And you can't really unpick those two things. So you've got famous white supremacist murderers. Breivik is a very clear example of this. The beginning of his manifesto was, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates. He railed against modern feminism as one of the greatest threats to society. But very few people know that because we can't seem to recognize that these things relate. And in very complicated ways when it comes to getting justice as well. So if you look back at one of the things we were discussing earlier, I think with online abuse, it's always a really clear way of kind of highlighting this. If you are a privileged, a middle-class white woman, particularly if you're young and photogenic, and you're experiencing abuse on social media, your case is very likely to be picked up in the press. You're likely to find yourself on the front pages. Think of the women that we know who've experienced that kind of abuse and how quickly the media picks up their stories. Taylor Swift is a good example of this, I think. Then you get journalists ringing up the social media platforms saying, what are you going to do in this case? And because social media platforms systemically utterly fail to tackle sexualized violence on their platforms, it means that they respond in those cases. So if you get picked up in the media, a social media platform will say, oh, we're going to deal with that. We're going to deal with that, as Taylor Swift's case was a really good example of. But if you're a woman of color, if you're a trans woman, if you're a disabled woman whose case is not so likely to be picked up in the press, social media companies are simply replying to your request saying this doesn't violate our terms.
Right.
In other words, the whole system at every level works to stifle the voices that are already most marginalized on those platforms. So it is all so complex and so intertwined, so far beyond the idea of, oh, well, if you're a Black woman, sometimes you get sexism and sometimes you get racism.
Tucker Carlson repeated the replacement theory this week. I don't know if you saw that.
Oh my God, I didn't see that.
It's been in the news this week. And it goes even beyond what we talked about, which is the kind of laundering of the ideas, right? It was quite explicit. And the other thing that when you were speaking, when Anders Breivik killed all of those people and his manifesto was being poured over, as you say, I don't think we can say this enough, no major outlets reported on his misogyny or his white supremacy. Time magazine, in the first article that they published about him, went through the entire manifesto and never mentioned it. It was astounding to see. And so, let's talk a little bit about people's discomfort. I mean, you and I, before the event started, were talking about the difficulty of shedding light on this problem. This has been true for years. And being told you can't use accurate descriptions or words. Even the name of your book is extremely difficult for some people to say the words, right? Not to say the words or hold the book up and say, I'm reading a book with this title, I mean, in the case of my book, anger makes people uncomfortable, but your book is literally naming, it uses the word men. And can you talk about the trajectory of power when language like that is unwelcome?
Well, I think what it is that we are so much more comfortable talking about homogenizing other groups than white men.
Right.
We're very comfortable lumping together other communities and other groups, but we afford white men the privilege of discrete identities and therefore individual motivations. And when you have a book title called Men Who Hate Women, people hear men hate women, and that panics them because we are afraid of offending men. In just the same way that we are fairly comfortable as a society talking about violence against women, but we find it very uncomfortable to discuss male violence. We can talk about, when we try to talk about toxic masculinity, when we're really discussing societal iteration of masculinity that is deeply harmful and traumatic to men and boys, people hear toxic men. So we are not used to naming this problem. We are used to finding excuses for these men because we humanize them in the way that we don't humanize, for example, a mass killer who has black or brown skin. And so that's why when these men kill, first of all, they're about 300% less likely to get coverage at all when they commit massacres than non-white men. But when they do, the coverage has these cherubic photos of them as babies, and it has quotes from their neighbor about how they were really kind and helped with DIY. And this is true even of killers like Elliot Rodger. There's an extensive New York Times piece about how troubled he was as a child, about how he was bullied, that takes from his manifesto elements of times that were difficult in his life without mentioning the parts where he says that he wants to massacre all women because they're fucking sluts who wouldn't sleep with him and so on. So it's very difficult to name the problem when the media is so focused on seeing these men in a different way, and when we shy away so much as a society from talking about a problem with white men. It's something that we find very difficult to do. It seems so stupidly obvious to say it, but when we know that 98% of terrorists are men, if you look, as I did for this book, at lots of the kind of national level counter-extremism, counter-terror organizations and their resources, for example, the resources that they send to schools, the words men and the words boy or girl, they aren't in there. They
aren't in there.
we can't recognize it. We can't recognize that this is a phenomenon that is happening to and is happening by men because we're so squeamish about that.
So let's talk about two things, because I know you studied this intensely. We've both written about it. When you describe these groups, there is like across them all is this idea of entitlement to women in their bodies, and of aggrieved entitlement when that connection is broken or when it's threatened in the culture. And so we see it in mass shootings, like in Atlanta, and we hesitate, as you say, to name the misogyny and the racism as terroristic, right? As political. And the thing about terrorism is that it's supposed to stem from political ideology, and we don't understand what's happening as a political ideology in our media or culture. But can you talk about the ways in which domestic violence and these types of terroristic acts are related, and frankly, just the sheer number of mass shootings and terroristic attacks that begin in acts of domestic violence? I mean, I think like in the US, I think of Sandy Hook, the Sandy Hook shooting, which people may not associate with this, but the first person that the shooter killed was his mother at home. And it's not a spouse, but it is the same kind of dynamic in terms of where the violence begins.
Which is so often the case. 54% of the time, in fact, in mass shootings in the US, a family member or a spouse is killed. So the connection between domestic violence and mass attacks is enormous. Around a third of the perpetrators of mass shootings in the US have a history of stalking, abuse, or domestic violence against women. What it means is that we're talking about the same thing writ large, essentially. Domestic abuse is everyday terrorism. It's controlling by fear. It is a form of everyday terrorism. It's a way of seizing power and control, and these things are always about power and control through fear and through violence. It's just whether you do it on a domestic scale or a mass scale. But where it becomes extremely, extremely frustrating is that we aren't making that link. So what that means is that we find it incredibly difficult to relate the two, because when we use the word terrorism, people think of something that is extraordinary. They think of something literally out of the ordinary, something extreme and terrifying. And racism and violence against women are not out of the ordinary. They are the wallpaper of our daily lives. And what that means is that when people commit mass atrocities in the name of those motivating factors, we don't see them as terrorism because we are used to those things. Violence against women is so common. 1 in 3 women on the planet will be raped or beaten in her lifetime. Here in the UK, 1 woman every 3 days is killed by a current or former partner. This is something that is so overwhelmingly common that we find it really difficult to get our heads around the idea that it can be something extreme, because we have normalized it to such a degree. We've become so desensitized to it. And so we find it really difficult to make those connections. And if we took violence against women and domestic abuse seriously, then these women are sort of canaries in coal mines, quietly dying, being beaten, being murdered. And further down the line, that same perpetrator goes on to massacre a whole bunch of people, many of whom are men, and suddenly everybody cares. But if, for example, we tighten gun control legislation in certain states to make it more difficult for men with any form of a record of domestic abuse to ever obtain another firearm, then we would be preventing some of these atrocities. So you can't unlink domestic violence and violence against women from what we're talking about. But it's also, I think, because it's something that people find so difficult to take seriously, it's something that people find very difficult to recognize as a layer. If you look at the coverage from the Atlanta shootings, for example, there were some media outlets who managed to make the connection with hatred of Asian Americans and with that particular form of abuse. But there were very few who managed to recognize that that could be combined with violence against women, with the hatred of women, with misogynistic supremacy. And there was almost nobody who made the connection that there were very specific religious issues at play here around abstinence education and forcibly dehumanizing young men's female peers into this kind of bracket of a form of temptation, which just happened to overlap extremely with particular forms of racialized, sexualized violence and stereotypes around Asian women. But it felt like that was a connection too far for the mainstream media to manage at all.
So before we go on, I just want to encourage the audience to please start adding questions, because we're going to move over to the Q&A in about 5 minutes. As you know, we've described this and talked about these dynamics. Can you talk about the fight against this? The organizations and the people that you feel get it and are working hard to try and change it or push against it?
Yeah, so there is an incredible men's movement, which was founded in the kind of late 1960s, early 1970s, as a kind of complementary movement to the second wave of feminism. And it was this incredible, it was called the men's liberation movement at the time. And it was something that it kind of breaks my heart, because if you listen to the things that they said, they sound groundbreaking now. So these were organizations of men who said, women are not our enemy. The way in which we are forced to be men in this world is what is harming both us and women. They were men who wanted to look at the way in which masculinity was harming and constraining men, but also the ways in which it was part of a much wider issue with sexism and gender inequality in society. So they were both looking at the role that men played in perpetuating gender inequality, but also the way in which men themselves were victims of it. And this movement was something that grew and grew. They had kind of men's talking circles where they encouraged men to talk about their feelings and their experiences. And then there was a schism in the movement, essentially, where it kind of split in two. And one part of the movement became what is now known as the men's rights movement, which is the men's rights activists I look at in the book, who are extremely good at getting attention and headlines, extremely good at propaganda and at recruiting young men to their cause. And then quietly continuing to this day are a group of real men's movements who are actually battling sexual violence, actually continuing the fight to engage young men globally in trying to end gendered violence and gender inequality. So organizations like Promundo are a really good example of this. The White Ribbon Campaign is an example of this. Here in the UK, the Good Lad Initiative, where men go into schools and talk to boys about all of these kinds of issues. The trouble, I think, is that its kind of evil twin, if you like, has become the much noisier and more successful propaganda outfit. So what we're seeing, and what I find in the book, is an incredibly slick propaganda machine, a radicalization machine that has become extremely adept at maximizing, for example, algorithms on social media platforms like YouTube, using cultural memes and touch points, using viral YouTube videos, reaching out to boys across their headsets as they're gaming in their bedrooms, finding them on bodybuilding forums. I think it's really important to say that they are radicalizing young men incredibly effectively and incredibly quickly. And if people are watching and thinking, well, my child would never go to an incel forum, so I don't need to worry about this, it's so far beyond that. They are finding boys where they are, and they're using jokes very deliberately. It's all a joke until it isn't. And they describe this as adding cherry flavor to children's medicine. They're very specific about how they're doing it. They start from the age of 11. That's when they begin to target boys. And very specifically, they see anti-feminism and hatred of women as a slipway to white nationalism and white supremacy.
Yes.
They are using these as recruitment tactics, actually, for white supremacist and neo-Nazi jokes. And you can see that in the trajectory of many of the men who made their name in the men's rights movement or in anti-feminist campaigns like Gamergate, who have then gone on to become mainstays of the white supremacist world.
Yes. You know, I too, I mean, you and I think we've been engaged in a lot of campaigns and writing about this, and I agree with you. You really can't stress enough to parents, and I think this is an important thing. I think a lot of parents think of gaming in an old analog toy way, like it's harmless and kids are doing this, and I don't know how to put it. It's like opening your front door and letting anybody into your child's bedroom.
Yeah.
Literally, because the gaming networks have been so effective. Used for recruitment of all types of extremism, actually, but it's just organic. And there's one thing I want to ask before we go to the questions, because I'm just dying of curiosity too. Going undercover to see what it was like.
Yeah, I wanted to not give them a fair hearing exactly, but experience it through the eyes of one of their own. I thought that was really important. And I wanted to really live that process of being nudged into it really gently, and not just going straight to the forums, but starting out. So I created an alter ego, a young guy called Alex, a young white man who felt kind of like he wasn't much of a success in life. He didn't have much luck with girls, and he felt kind of uncomfortable with the media suddenly calling him privileged all the time when he didn't feel very privileged. But he was mostly into gaming, and he was hanging out mostly on gaming strategy chat rooms. And it was places like that where he first started hearing these kind of jokes dropped into the conversation, little mentions, feminism is cancer. And then very gradually he got kind of linked to like, oh, mate, you should come on this pickup website. It's got amazing tips for women. And very gradually the jokes became more and more extreme, but it was just men blowing off steam, right? It was just guys being guys. And it was incredibly appealing because gradually along the way, there were in jokes. There was a kind of whole language that was created that no one else outside would understand. There was a sense of belonging, a sense of pride, a sense of brotherhood, of community, and most seductively of all, a place where he could be told that he was the underdog. He was the one battling oppression. It wasn't like out there where everyone was suddenly telling him that he was oppressing people. He was a comrade in arms, fighting for something meaningful with a purpose. And all of that is lacking offline for young men. We've seen massive cuts here in the UK to youth funding for youth centres, for the offline spaces where young men would get that sense of community. And posing as a very vulnerable young man, it's really easy to see how quickly you get taken under people's wings and you get pulled into and welcomed into these communities. And it was incredibly eye-opening, and it was incredibly fast, and it just spiraled. It's the only word I know to describe it. It's a slippery slope, and you cannot put your finger on where the jokes and the irony suddenly stop being jokes, and suddenly you're really saying that women should be massacred and deserve to be kept as sexual slaves.
It's amazing.
By the time it happens, you've heard so much of that stuff and laughed that it's difficult not to be quite desensitized to it. And that's how it works. That's how they get them.
That's right. So, all right, we have some questions. Shane, do you want to go through those? Do you want me to?
Sure. I've kind of been making sure that everything is upfront and very respectful. We do have a lot of questions and a lot of people watching from all over. So thank you all so much for being here today. This is an incredible conversation, and it is like, I thought that I was pretty well informed, and it's kind of mind-blowing how much more there is to know about this community and how terrible they are. So thank you for this conversation. Let's start with a question from Elena. So Elena says, hi, Laura and Soraya. I have a question for Laura. How was your book received by the mass media? Do you see journalists changing their language, and is the response different in the US versus the UK?
Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your question. It's early days, I think. There has certainly been a nervousness about the book. I was telling Soraya just before the event that it's extremely common in particularly kind of mainstream media interviews for the interviewer to start by saying, we need to preface this obviously by saying that not all men hate women, and that this isn't about all men, and that we're really not, this isn't about offending men. Most men would never dream of this stuff. So I think there's certainly been a panic about it, as we've said, about this idea of talking about men and using the term men. It has been covered pretty gamely in the UK, I would say. There has been a lot of coverage. There's been a lot of backlash. So when the media do cover it, they tend to get some pretty disturbing backlash as a result afterwards, which is difficult and obviously makes it harder to keep the conversation going. I think it's early days yet to say that there's necessarily been a kind of shift in media reporting as a result of the book. In the US, I think perhaps people are a little bit more aware of some of these movements, so it hasn't been quite the same kind of delicacy with the media handling it. Really, the biggest response that I've had has been women getting in touch whose lives have been affected by this and who haven't had anyone to talk to about it, or have wondered if they're the only ones. So I've heard from a huge number of women whose lives have been massively affected by pickup artists, by men who have been effectively trained into sexual assault techniques by pickup artists on pickup artist forums, and who have in some cases found their own rapes explicitly documented on pickup forums after they've happened. I've been contacted contacted by a huge number of women who are worried about very vulnerable young men in their family, often sons. One woman, particularly heartbreakingly, she got in touch and said that she was so concerned about her teenage son and felt he had really been radicalized that she'd actually contacted social services to ask for support and to say that she was concerned he might be a danger. And they had literally, the words they used were, if it were ISIS, we'd be interested, but we can't help you with this. So there's been a real outpouring, I think, of people saying, yes, this thing that you've named has affected me, but there isn't anywhere to go. There isn't any support.
Yeah, I think I want to add something to this. Laura and I actually, the campaign we worked on had to do with depictions of rape and violence against women on Facebook. And it was in 2013, and we tried to get advertisers to stop supporting these pages that were profuse, and to get Facebook to actually follow their own guidelines, which stated that they would not allow hateful content on the basis of gender identity, race, ethnicity, etc. But any kind of depiction of rape or domestic violence or other kind of gender-based violence wasn't being removed at all. And so we engaged in this campaign with a very big coalition, a global coalition of about 100 orgs. And then Elliot Rodgers happened. And what happened after his shooting spree was that, and this happens every single time, copycat pages from these networks are created that champion what this killer has done. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at all, Laura, but what I thought was interesting in the wake of our campaign was that those copycat pages on Facebook were taken down. And they were taken down because Facebook had agreed to recognize hate against women. And yet the law enforcement and government, for example, and I know that this has a huge overlap with issues of mass incarceration, but I called the police department there, and there was no sense at all that this may have been a hate crime, that it may have been related to all of the issues that Laura is talking about and writing about. And so this disconnect, I think, is global, as are these movements. I will say that, Laura, maybe you want to comment on that. But if you're Laura in London, or if you're me in the US and you get this kind of hate, it can come from anywhere in the world. It's not something that your local jurisdiction can manage.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that makes it so difficult to tackle, right? Because the internet is essentially the Wild West, that we haven't caught up with forms of law breaking that are happening online, even when it's illegal for someone to threaten to rape or kill you online, just as it would be if they did it to your face in the street. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're in any meaningful way tackled, or that, as you say, that justice systems are able to do it.
I want to share a segment of the comments from Iman before we get to a question. But Iman says, many seem to think incels and MGTOW communities are to be laughed at, but these people are incredibly dangerous and should be seen as that. And then the question is, as a guy in my mid-20s studying criminology, I've recently become much more interested in researching feminism, domestic violence, sexual assault, etc. I've read Everyday Sexism and Men Who Hate Women. It's helped inspire me to pursue a career in this. My question is, where should I go from here? I'd love to work with you both one day or talk to you more in depth on this, but the work you do is truly inspiring and I want to help.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you for the work you're doing. It sounds really important. I think it's very common for men more widely to be asking at the moment, how can I be an ally? What can I do to help? When we come to these particular communities of men, we are talking about radicalization, and de-radicalizing is incredibly difficult. It's a notoriously hard process that requires a huge amount of expertise and time and funding, and there is no organization that is de-radicalizing men from male supremacist communities. There are very few working with white supremacists and neo-Nazis, but those organizations are there. And the learning that we have from those forms of de-radicalization and that expertise is that these men are not necessarily going to listen to Soraya and I because they have been radicalized to believe that we are evil, man-hating, feminazi bitches, but they might listen to you. They are much more likely to be open to conversations with other men. And in particular, I think boys and men who might be on a vulnerable pathway towards radicalization, that pathway is much more likely to be disrupted through conversations with other men than it is through listening to women like me and Soraya, because those men won't be attending events like these. They won't be showing up. But they might be men who are in your social circle. They might be men who are in your locker room, who are in your friendship group or your extended family, whatever it is. So I think one thing that all men can do is to have this conversation with 5 other men. And that really can make a massive difference if enough men choose to do that. I think that's something very effective.
I want to add something here. Laura, you can maybe disagree, but I have spoken to so many parents, and I only say this half jokingly. If you are around young boys, nephews, students, your son, and you hear their language change from using the names of their friends or relatives or even women celebrities to using the word female, the females, I would pay attention to that. It's a shift in the language that's being informed by a community that probably is adjacent to or fully informed by the ideas that Laura is describing, because that distancing, that the females is a linguistic objectification.
Mm-hmm.
And you see it sometimes in young boys who are maybe 12, 13 years old. They're starting to game. They're in communities that are all male very often, and it's exactly those kind of backdoors into those communities that Laura writes about.
Absolutely. And there's a number of other red flags, kind of words to look out for that I mention in the book as well for parents. Any kind of sudden intolerance to an alternative viewpoint, any real resistance to even having a conversation is a red flag for any form of extremism and radicalization. But there are specific words, any kind of pill, black pilled, red pilled, blue pilled, the word triggered, butthurt, woke even, talking about normies, which is the term used within these communities for people outside of them, and anything that kind of seems to you to be a word for women that isn't women. Foid is the most commonly used term on these forums, which is a shortening of female humanoid. Anything that really is about dehumanizing. And actually, I think for anybody with a young person in their lives, particularly at a very young age, people often ask me, what can I do to try and almost inoculate my children against this? Like, how can I support my son not to be drawn into this? The thing I always say is that I think encouraging platonic mixed sex friendships from a very early age is one of the absolutely best inoculations that you could give your child, because these forms of hatred are able to take hold if you can completely dehumanize an entire group of people into an other, in the same way that other forms of radicalization and extremism work. And when I say that, people often say, but boys and girls do mix. They mix at school. So I don't understand. That doesn't work. But actually, from a very young age, boys and girls self-segregate in school and out. If you think about it, even at a toddler group, perhaps your child is 2 years old and they sit down to play with a toy with another child, and someone will pipe up and say something like, oh, look, they're on their first date, or I think he has a little crush. We use these phrases like lock up your daughters, or he's going to be a heartbreaker. We sexualize as a society mixed sex children's friendships and interactions from an extraordinarily young age. And children learn from that. They hear that and they learn, this isn't an appropriate friendship for me platonically. I need to see this opposite sex as something embarrassing, as something sexualized, and that there isn't an opportunity for a simple, straightforward friendship there. What that means is that by the age of perhaps 7 or 8, you've got kids in the playground, children at lunch break, literally segregating and lining up on opposite sides of the playgrounds, grouped by gender. And that isn't something that we necessarily recognize as a problem, them because people see it as boys being boys. They see it as normal. You know, we bombard them with, if they want to have a party, invitations where you either have a pink princess party invitation or a blue pirate party, and it's assumed and implied by the world around us that you won't be inviting kids of the opposite sex to your party. So you start to see that that is supported at every level, and what that means is it's much easier to radicalize a boy who doesn't have a close female friend. So if you want to protect them, encourage them to make friends with kids of all genders, I would say.
Yeah. Also, it's institutionalized because, I mean, if you go into schools, there are schools where teachers are still, for no reason, lining up boys on one side and girls on another.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that you go into a library and there are boys for books, books for boys and books for girls, and you really have to beg the question: why making these distinctions? Why are you pointing out the differences instead of the similarities in ways that are completely not relevant either to their emotional, you know, well-being or their physical development, you know?
We have so many really good questions. So I think we'll do a question from Jennifer, and hopefully we'll have time for one more after that. But so I am queer, and that's not very well hidden based on a lot of what I wear and what I say and do in these events. But Jennifer's question is, how does violence against the LGBTQ plus community, especially transgender, relate to these groups? Is it also related to the new United States state laws that are being passed against trans people, and in some cases the entire LGBTQ plus community? In some states, medical personnel do not have to provide medical care to LGBTQ plus patients based on moral, ethical, or religious grounds. And so I'm wondering, as well as Jennifer, like how, like, are these communities as like angry, and what are their feelings for the trans community?
Yes, I think Soraya will be able to speak perhaps more specifically to specific law shifts happening in the US, but I can certainly say at a more general level that in just the same way that we have described this kind of fitting in with inherent racism, with other forms of prejudice, this is very much part of the same soup that they are swimming in, if you like. These are groups, I would say, that go almost... it's not just a hatred of LGBT folk, it's almost an erasure of their identities. These are groups which in their entire discourse either fail to acknowledge the existence of LGBT folk or extremely actively bar them from membership of the groups. They have often very kind of overtly religious overtones to their conversation. If you think about a group that is obsessed with the idea of women as essentially as dehumanized producers of babies, you're talking about groups which are extremely gender essentialist in their viewpoints, groups which are extremely homophobic, groups with an extremely heteronormative idea of what a relationship looks like, of what a marriage looks like, and of what the function of those groups are. So they absolutely are rife with transphobia, with homophobia within the groups, but it goes beyond those just being elements that are there. I think I would say that it goes much more to the roots of their whole worldview, that these are groups that not only do they fail to recognize, but that they are committed to eradicating, essentially. So you might see, for example, conversations going on there, which again, I would say are eugenics-oriented conversations. And it's very much part of that same sense of an extremely simplistic and a kind of extremely nationalistic idea of a white man who is the head of a heteronormative family unit, and that anything outside of that is something that they see as a threat that needs to be destroyed, essentially.
Yeah, and I would add that I agree with everything Laura just said, and I think it's also important to link it to authoritarianism and rising authoritarianism in the US and abroad, because the rigidity of these binary worldviews, right? The heteronormative, cisnormative, white normative. I think we really need to make sure we include that in the summation of what's considered normative. All of that means that the people who break the rules, the people who threaten the rules, deserve to be punished for doing it. And so women who are free, women who demand laws that protect them as citizens, women who say no, queer people, trans people, anyone who in their own bodies transgress against those laws and rules and ideation of binaries. You know, they're dehumanized in all the ways that Laura just described. And the ideology is one in which if you break the rules, you deserve to be punished, because we have rules, and when you break rules, you're punished. And so we see the punishment come in the form of extreme street harassment. So, you know, you really can't walk down the street in some places without being harassed. But if you're a Black trans woman, the chances that you're harassed and that leads to violence and possibly like bodily injury and death is just much higher. And think about the ways in which a Black trans woman transgresses in this worldview, you know? And so I think that these are completely indivisible.
And of course, that legislation essentially that doubles down those views completely and utterly normalizes and gives the green light to them, right? If
That's
you're
right.
in a state where you see legislation being enacted that marginalizes and harms those folks, then it is essentially a state-sponsored condoning of those worldviews, right? It sends the message that this is something that you're doing the right thing. The state is behind you. It sends that message that this is kind of linked into a kind of sick form of patriotism, which of course is what we're seeing in white nationalism. And it feeds back into this idea of protecting your country from those transgressions. And if you see that being enacted in legislation, then it is a kind of a tacit endorsement of that ideology, I would say.
Can I add one other thing? Because I know we have to go, but there are several questions here about religion. All of these things, I think, exist on a spectrum. I grew up very Catholic. My family is Catholic and Anglican. And so I come from a traditional patriarchal religious background. It's extremely hard to live in those environments and appreciate the degree to which these ideologies are inherent to those religious communities. Complementary roles for men and women, all male priesthoods, those are meaningful, right? Those have really deep consequences for society, way beyond a person's faith in God. You know, the institutions that are shaped around religion, I think we need to be really challenging them.
Absolutely.
I want to thank you both so much for this incredible conversation. In a lot of ways, very eye-opening, and I hope that the audience, I actually know that the audience appreciated the conversation as much as I did. A reminder that Laura's book, Men Who Hate Women, is available for sale at left-bank.com. I provided a link in the comments. I have also provided a link for Soraya's book, Rage Becomes Her. So both of those are available to order. You can have them available for pickup, for mailing anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. And if you do, I put a link for how to, or information about how to order, order internationally as well. I thank you to the audience for showing up, but especially Laura and Soraya. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I hope that everyone has a fantastic rest of your day, and I hope this inspires you as much as it did me to encourage change and to keep your eyes open, and let's make the world a better place. Like, let's work on that. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.